Listening to the other speakers, I just want to go off script slightly at the risk of going a little late. I was thinking of people that I was asked here because I go to a lot of wars, and I'm a journalist, and I'm honored to be here. However, I don't think of myself as particularly courageous. What I think when I think back on my experiences in 20-odd battlegrounds around the world, what I mostly remember is my feeling of all-consuming fear. And I wonder, since one does acquire a kind of professional pathology of returning again and again to places and experiences that become familiar because one knows how to do it, and out of a feeling of curiosity in the world, I wonder if one form of what we call courage, with all of its, with all that term is imbued, is really a kind of controlled form of fear. And I think of a woman that I met years ago in Nicaragua on a reporting trip where I had to fly in by helicopter. That was the scariest part of the experience, because it was a clandestine helicopter trip, and therefore one could have been shot down. Nothing happened. But I arrived at a jungle camp where I was the guest for a few days of a bad guy, really. He was called Tigrillo. He was a Contra commander fighting against the Sandinista government. And we traveled by mule through the jungle during the rainy season. Even the mules slid and fell down and things. But I noticed that Tigrillo, this commander, he's a small, muscular guy with long blonde hair. He rode a horse that never fell. And there was a rather beautiful woman in her 30s who always walked behind him, just behind him. And whenever there was a moment to stop for water or something at a stream, she would wash what clearly were his clothes, his socks, that kind of thing. And I never really had a chance to speak to her until 3 or 4 days into my time there. And Tigrillo had left the camp to visit some frontline position or something. And this woman, Melida, found a way to speak to me in the presence of a couple of other fighters around the campfire. And she told me that she wanted me to know that she was, formally speaking, she was a combatant. She was a member of this guerrilla force. And then she told me her story, which was that she was a school teacher who had been kidnapped from her village a year and a half before, and along with 2 other teachers, she had left behind 2 very small children and her husband, and taken on a forced march by the guerrillas into the jungle. She'd been abducted. And about an hour out of the village, they stopped, and in front of her, they stabbed to death and cut the throats of her friends. And she was allowed to live on the understanding that she teach them and be Tigrillo's woman, which is what she was at that moment when I met her. And I thought, first of all, that she was extremely courageous in telling me that while still in the camp controlled by her tormentor, her master. And I looked at the eyes of the 2 guerrillas that were within earshot listening to us, and they nodded in confirmation of her story. And I understood then that they too were there against their wills. And I was left with the dilemma of what to do with this knowledge and what to do with this information. And in the end, because I depended on that group to get back out to the neighboring country and eventually report a story, I realized that I couldn't identify her or she would be killed. And therefore, as a journalist, I couldn't really do very much. About the only thing I could do at that moment was slip her a piece of paper with a telephone number to call me on it if she were ever able to get out of the jungle and cross the border. She never did. But I always think of her when I think of courage. So, that's off script. So, going back to my prepared text, this idea of being considered courageous for working as a journalist caused some introspection on my part. But in fact, people often do ask me why I go to wars. I usually say that it's so that I can document the history of my time. As a child, I dreamt of being a witness to the times of my life, and reporting as a journalist has given me that opportunity. But there is, I confess, another reason too, and it's not, as many think, and as, in fact, as Bob Simon said, somehow undercutting my sort of highfalutin definition here, a war addiction or an adrenaline fix. I was born in the late 50s after World War II in Korea, and I came of age during one of America's most traumatizing wars, Vietnam. I was the son of a Foreign Service officer and a writer mother, and I'd lived in 8 countries by the age of 18. Before I was an adult, I saw my own country as foreigners did, and in my life since, I've also continued to live much of the time abroad, and my real pathology is probably that of feeling to be somehow a kind of intermediary presence, always condemned to being American, explaining my country to the rest of the world, and yet also condemned to see my own country through the rest of the world's eyes. So I think I cover conflicts because I'm an American who has grown up at a time when my country was at the very apogee of its superpower status. In my lifetime, my country, rightly or wrongly, and for better or worse, has defined itself in much of the world as a military power, and an interventionist one at that, sending in troops wherever and whenever it perceives threats, from Grenada in Panama to Iraq and Afghanistan, or in more covert roles in many places around the world. In all of the countries where America's intervened or aided and abetted proxy wars in the name of anti-communism or anti-terrorism, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, very little has been done by the United States to make amends for the damage that it has left behind or is perceived to have left behind. Sometimes perception is reality. Truly, American power often collides with American principles. So if I've gone to war, it is because war has been the defining ingredient of the times I live in. And the reason I keep going is because I've found that I can find out things that no one else is telling me and which seem important. Melida's story is just one of many examples. Perhaps it's a vain hope, but I do suppose I cling to the notion that such knowledge can help us all, and perhaps sometimes even save lives. There's a more recent story I want to share. A couple of years ago in Baghdad, I met a man called Ali. He had embarked on a killing spree to avenge his own brother, who had been murdered by militiamen of his own sect a few months earlier. Ali had vowed before God to kill 10 men for each of his dead brother's fingers. Ali told me that he would not stop until he had killed 100 men, whether members of the militia responsible or, if not, their brothers and fathers. At that point, he had killed 20. From each of his victims, he informed me, he sliced off a piece of their bodies, a hand, a toe, an eyeball, an Adam's apple, and he took it to his mother, who then traveled to the gravesite of her son, Ali's brother, and buried the pieces in the soil next to him. I went to see Ali's mother. She confirmed the story. She told me that as she buried the pieces, she spoke to her dead son and told him the names of the latest man's life taken by Ali to avenge his death. Ali said to me that ever since he had begun his revenge killings, he no longer felt any fear, and he felt closer to God. God, Ali told me, approved of what he was doing because the men he was killing were evil and did not deserve to live.